Welcome everyone, Costini here with a further discussion on one of the new units that's coming with the Shadows That Change DLC, coming alongside patch 4.0 for Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires and Realms of Chaos. Now there's been a lot of discussion, of course, about the DLC in general, but one particular unit has gotten a lot of attention, and these are the Akshina Ambushers that Kislev is getting. Now, the way people feel about this, based on what people have commented and I've read on Reddit, is that they think that this unit is basically going to make the entire Kislev roster completely worthless. As someone who has spent a lot of hours in the DLC so far, I don't believe that this is quite the case. It's certainly a good unit, and in fact, I would dare argue it's probably the best unit in the entire DLC by far. But does that mean that the entire Kislev roster is made meaningless because of the addition of this particular unit? Yes and no. So let's take a look at what the unit does. I've already covered the stats, but let's consider what options does Kislev have in your campaigns. So looking at the Kislev recruitment options, if we're considering it. At tier 1, you either get the choice of recruiting regular Kossars or Kossars with spears if you have a Kossar hut, the tier 1 barracks. Now the difference between the two of these units is that the Kossars with spears have an anti-large attack. The regular Kossars, they might perform better against like infantry. So the Kossars with spears are against large units, cavalry in particular. The regular Kossars might handle themselves well against might handle themselves better against infantry. Now, Kossars are a fairly decent unit. I'm going to use the unit and spell browser over here. Now, Kossars are a fairly decent unit for what they are. They are, however, a bit expensive. Goblin archers for the greenskins are better in almost every way that matters, in terms of ranged ability, even armor, actually. But the Kossars are certainly a decent unit. They do 16 base missile damage, have an armor-piercing missile damage of 3, and a reload time of 11 seconds. That's how Kossars work. And they also have the By Our Blood ability, where basically they become unbreakable for 30 seconds when leadership is wavering or lower. This is a double-edged sword, because it does mean that these units will fight for much longer, but it also means that they might be completely killed in a battle. Because units, when they rout, and especially when they're completely breaking, they generally are losing and taking significant casualties, so this is not necessarily a benefit, as you might necessarily think. They also have 20 ammunition. Now, Kossars are capable of handling most of the early game threats you'll encounter, with the exception of heavily armored targets, which is an issue for Kislev considering you're dealing with Warriors of Chaos. Azazel, in particular, is a problem. And also all the big guns, Draika's hordes from literal hell. That's how it feels to deal with Draika. You just don't really have a good option, or you didn't before this DLC, to deal with those units from a range perspective, because Kossars just wouldn't do the damage that was required. And even the units that you did have later on in the campaign, they also weren't going to do a great job from a range perspective. Keep in mind, we're talking about range, though I'll talk also about the overall situation in terms of like an army design. But you didn't really have great ranged options to deal with heavily armored units in particular. Because if we look at the Kislev roster, you have Streltsy, right? Streltsy do have a 17 missile strength. They do 5 base missile damage, but they also do 17 armor-piercing missile damage. They also have a good amount of armor, good amount of leadership, as do all Kislev units, and they also have By Our Blood. Now, they're also decent in melee, with most of their damage in both melee and range being armor-piercing damage, something important to understand. Now, here's the thing about Streltsy. While they certainly are capable of doing damage against heavily armored targets, the problem Streltsy encounter is that gunpowder units in general in the game are fairly freaking broken. And as a result of that particular situation, Streltsy, while they certainly are useful if you can get their shots off, are always going to be limited by terrain. This is a major issue, a major headache to deal with if you're playing Kislev, in particular in sieges. So they do have a severe limitation with respect to that. And then you have the Ice Guard. The problem with the Ice Guard is they don't have armor piercing, which is an issue. They do have obviously more armor piercing than regular casters, but Ice Guard are more of a support unit. They're also more of an anti-demonic unit because they have magical attacks. So they're good against a lot of physical resistance. They can do decently well against Treekin since they'll deal with that physical resistance benefit they have. But obviously they're not going to deal with all the armor. Now you have two versions of the Ice Guard. You have the one that's better against infantry and melee, and you have the one that's better against large and melee with most of their damage coming in armor piercing. So the ones with swords are pretty much never worth recruiting because, yeah, the benefit against infantry is useful until you realize the ones with glaives are generally going to do better against heavily armored targets, especially by the time you get them. But the issue, again, with Ice Guard is they're not a frontline unit. They're a support unit. They should be viewed as a support unit. So you end up in the situation as Kislev before this patch where for the faction that's focused on ranged combat, you actually don't have any good late-game ranged unit. Certainly not the unit that you can mass your entire armies with. Your better plan, if you were playing as Kislev before patch 4.0, before the addition of the Shadows to Change DLC, a much better plan would have been to get Warbear Riders, to get Heavy War Sleds, to get Sargard, and basically make Kislev work with a combination of an infantry, cavalry, sled army. That was the better decision. And even forgo range completely, because if you have a diverse army like this, it might seem great and it is good in combat. The problem is the result is not going to be that fantastic, and it is going to encounter some severe limitations. Or it would before the addition of this DLC, because with this DLC, things do change because of the Akshina Ambushers. That's what they're doing. They're finally giving Kislev a really good ranged option that they can use throughout the entire campaign. So this means that Kislev armies are going to be different. You are no longer going to be in the meta of where you just build Cossars in the early game, then get a bunch of armor Cossars, and eventually switch to Sargar, Bear Cav, and Sleds later on once you do acquire them. Now you do have an alternative. But let's talk about the Akshina Ambushers. They are a powerful unit, as I've already covered in the previous video. The reason they're a powerful unit is they do a decent amount of base missile damage. They do most of their damage, or close, like well over 50% of their damage from is going to be armor piercing missile damage. And as a result, and they have a reload time of 12 seconds. Also, they have Vanguard deployment and stock, so they can avoid a lot of units that might kill them. They do have downsides. Let's not ignore the elephant in the room with respect to this, because this is important. They do have some fairly important downsides to talk about. So first off, when we're thinking about the Akshina Ambushers, the biggest downside is going to be the cost of the unit. Now, it's not the recruitment cost that's necessarily the problem, because if you're playing Kislev campaign, you can severely reduce the recruitment cost of a lot of units in your campaign. So over here in this particular province, because of the farm estates that I have 3 farm estates here, I'm severely reducing the recruitment cost by 90% basically. So I can recruit these guys much cheaper. They're, I think, $850 to recruit by default. So it really is that 30%. Sorry, I forgot that farms only work on a region by region basis. But still, you can reduce the cost by a significant amount, and then you have other benefits as well. Like for instance, Iron Smelter can reduce costs further. Over there, there's resource benefits that you can get if you're playing as Kislev. So you can severely reduce the cost of recruiting units if you are playing as Kislev. The problem is, and this is the issue for the Empire as well, by the way, because the Empire has a similar situation. Being able to recruit units for cheap is not as much of an advantage as you might think it is if you can't freaking afford those units, because upkeep is a major issue. This is the biggest problem I have with the Empire, and people saying, oh, you can recruit mass hordes of units. You can. You won't be able to maintain them. There's the problem. being able to recruit a lot of units for cheap is irrelevant. This is why the greenskins are so great as a race, because their units are incredibly cheap to recruit and maintain. That's important. So when we're looking at Kislev units, the Akshina Ambushers are the same upkeep cost as Streltsy. And Streltsy, when we're looking at Kislev infantry options, Streltsy are already on the higher tier. Tsarguard are more expensive. Let me be blunt about it. Tsarguard are far better as a unit. Like, these guys can go toe-to-toe in a melee fight against Warriors of Chaos, especially the two-handed version. They will hold the firm front line. They will do well on out-resolve. They won't break very easily in a battle because of their very high leadership. These guys are great. In fact, you can make an entire Kislev army work very well with just Tsarguard in the late game. So Tsarguard might be more expensive, but compared to Armor Kossars, compared to regular Kossars, Akshina Ambushers are almost twice the cost of a regular Kossar. And while they're certainly a lot better when you're dealing with armor targets, they aren't necessarily that much better when dealing with soft targets. And yes, you do deal with a lot of those. Skaven, for instance. Even greenskins might have a lot of soft targets. Vampires might have a lot of soft targets. So there's pros and cons. Ultimately, you have to remember that when you're dealing with a campaign in Mortal Empires, it's all about scalability and finding a balancing act between making high-quality armies, but also making more of those armies. Now, at this point in this campaign at turn 41, sure, I can afford an entire army of Tsarguard, Akshina Ambushers, and Streltsy. That isn't the problem. But early on in the campaign, those decisions will matter a great deal. Kislev's economy is not a good economy, and even if it was buffed significantly to, say, be as strong as the Dark Elf one, that just means you have that decision making doesn't change. It just means how many more armies do you run around with. Like, for instance, over here, I have like 5 armies in this entire campaign by turn 41. If Kislev had an economy that was twice as good and structures were cheaper, especially the economic structures, I'd probably be running with like, I don't know, 7, 8, 10 armies by this particular point. In this campaign where I certainly have taken a good amount of territory, let's just say 6. 7 would probably be pushing it too far. But you get the idea of the kind of choices you do have to make in a campaign. And this is where we need to talk about the role that the Akshina Ambushers have. In the late game, sure, afford as many as you can. But it's not necessarily the wisest idea to just go full on with Akshina Ambushers. That's why none of the armies that I have here, even though they do obviously have them in this campaign, Boris Ursus has them, this Ice Witch has them, this Ice Witch is getting them. Even though that is certainly the case, I do also, like with the exception of this army that just has basic Kossars because I never got around to getting other units for it. But like the armies I've been building since my economy has grown larger and I've gained more territory have been balanced armies. Why is that important? Why haven't I gone full on with the Akshina Ambushers? Let me explain my logic. Full range stacks are a thing of Warhammer 2. It made sense in Warhammer 2 to do it because of the melee benefits AI got in that particular game and because of the greater range firepower. To give you an idea, if you think the Akshina Ambushers are ridiculous in Warhammer 3, understand that the Dark Shards in Warhammer 2 are substantially better. Not necessarily in Warhammer 3, that's a different discussion. I think Akshina Ambushers are better than Dark Shards and Shades, but you still have... but in Warhammer 2, range had more power. If you in your hands, especially, and melee had less power. But that's no longer the case. Range has less power. So you cannot replicate the same situations you have in Warhammer 2 and Warhammer 3. Melee units will close the gap. They will get in your line. And yes, you can use the checkerboard formation. But ultimately, I find playing a lot of campaigns in Warhammer 3 that a mixed army or a pure melee army is actually the better choice. So you don't want to go full on ranged. I think that would be a significant mistake for Kislev. And Akshina Ambushers, they're not so durable in a melee situation that you can make that work. Now, maybe you could make the argument that the combination of Warbed Riders, Sleds, Streltsy with Akshina Ambushers would work, and you could avoid the Armor Kossars and Armor Kossars and Tsarguard, but it's not like Armor Kossars and Tsarguard are weak units. They're pretty solid. Like, Tsarguards are incredibly durable units that can withstand full-on Warriors of Chaos with ray weapons for quite a decent amount of time, while your ranged units kill. And that's the role your melee has in a Kislev army. Like, getting Armor Kossars is still worth it. They're a cheaper unit to recruit than Streltsy or Streltsy Tsarguard, Bearcav, or Akshina Ambushers, and they're quite capable at holding a line. Don't expect these guys to win the battle on their own, especially in sieges. This is one of the problems Kislev has, where their siege tactics suck, because having balanced armies for field battles is important, but in sieges you basically rely on full range because your melee is not good enough on the offense to win a siege battle on their own. Though certainly a balanced army can win virtually any siege. If you do have it, if you use the right tactics for it. So you do want a combination of melee and ranged in your armies. Okay, but why would you ever bother getting any kind of any other ranged unit in your army roster as Kislev? Because of the different roles they have. Streltsy are just more durable in melee, and they can take more of beating, so they can beat the tanks, the ranged tanks you have. They won't do as much damage because of the gunpowder situation they have, but at the same time, keep in mind, they have more than double the armor, and their melee capability is roughly on par. There is a bit of an awkward situation with regards to using both Streltsy and Akshina Ambushers. It's more so down to research really than anything else. Though keep in mind you can certainly buff the Streltsy arsenal, get that 10% ammunition and armor-piercing missile damage. But when you're looking at the research tree, for instance, there are things that there are certainly things that you would want to. There are things that you pick up that only benefit like Akshina Ambushers, or things that only benefit the non-gunpowder units. Like there's Glacial Prism, which only benefits Ice Guard, for instance. So you do have to keep in mind the research and the options you do have with respect to the research choices that you do have. But just keep in mind, the different roles that units have. As for regular Kossars are still a cheap unit that can handle many soft targets well. As for Ice Guard, they're a great unit to have, like 4 of, let's say if I was building an endgame army and I want to make a range-focused army, I might get anywhere between 2 to 4 Ice Guard, depending on what kind of army I want. Like if I was going full range, then yeah, I would probably get 4 Ice Guard, and the rest would be Akshina Ambushers. Some sleds there as well for, mobility and to draw the enemy into the line of fire. But Ice Guard are great because they can slow down enemies, and they will do better against targets with a lot of physical resistance, which does include demons. So there is certainly a role, and I think that what the Akshina Ambushers will do in a campaign is they will help fill a gap that did absolutely exist in the Kislev roster. They're strong. They're arguably the best unit in the entire DLC, but that doesn't mean you're not going to use the other units of Kislev. Don't view it from that perspective. I think it would be a severe mistake to do that. And I've played as Mother Stanke, I've played as Katrin, I've played actually all of the Legendary Lords of Kislev in this DLC, and I haven't been in that situation where I only wanted to recruit Akshina Ambushers. Another thing to also consider with respect to this is that you do need a tier 2 structure to recruit them, the Eerie Woods, and that does preclude you from getting other things. Like, it's fairly reasonable for a Kislev player to obviously get the Barracks Chain, because you do get the Armor Kossars. You could make the argument potentially that you don't need it anymore, like if you're just going to get a bunch of Akshina Ambushers. Though going without any Armor Kossars is not really a great idea. Though you could go full ranged until you're tier 3, and then you just switch to Tsar Guard eventually, right? Get the Tsar Guard recruitment option and just avoid the Barracks Chain. You could do that right now, because if you rely on the Akshina Ambushers, but the cost early on is going to be significant. And like one of the things I discovered in my Mother's Stankia campaign is that trying to maintain 2 full armies of Akshina Ambushers was not a great idea, suffice it to say. So I ended up with a combination of giant spiders, which are cheaper, by the way, as a unit, giant spiders, regular Kossars, and Akshina Ambushers to use in a campaign. Like, giant spiders, like, consider this, like, giant spiders, if you're playing Mother Stankia, are a great unit because, yeah, they have a similar role as Armored Kossars. They're not quite as good, but they're quite a bit cheap. They're like 30 upkeep, just a bit around 30 upkeep less. And they're almost just as durable, and they have poison attacks. So I've been in Mother Stankia's campaign, who can't recruit Armored Kossars, I've been using a combination of regular Kossars, Akshina Ambushers, and giant spiders for most of that campaign to go through it until you get an alliance with Kislev, and then you get all those regular units, and then you switch to Tsarguard, basically. That is my perspective on the matter. Questine signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and stay tuned for more.